In the spring of 1984, a man named Dale Pruitt stood in front of 40 operators in the Cannell County Fairgrounds equipment barn and told them that the age of animal draft power in the coal fields was finished. He said it pleasantly, the way a doctor delivers a diagnosis he has given many times. He had a laminated spec sheet and a slide carousel and clean steel-toed boots that had never once touched red clay mud, and he stood beside a brand-new diesel-powered skidding unit that glittered under the barn lights like something sent from another century. He gestured at the machine, then at his figures, then at the men in the folding chairs, and he said that any operator still running mule teams in these hollows was running a hobby operation. He meant it kindly. He was not a bad man. He simply believed that what a spec sheet could measure was the whole of what there was to know. About 60 miles east and 5.5 years later, in the fall of 1989, a woman named Ruth Nolan drove a rented sedan up a one-lane gravel road in Cannell County and sat down at a kitchen table with a certified scale ticket in her hand. She looked at the number on that ticket for a long time before she said anything. When she finally spoke, she asked a single question, and the man across from her answered it in 4 words. Ruth did not negotiate. She made an offer. The number on that ticket was $44,200. That is the story worth telling. It connects a dismissed old man and 40 animals that nobody wanted, and one chain so rusted it had been passed over at 3 estate sales. It runs through 5 years of quiet work in a seam too thin and too angled for any machine Dale Pruitt could sell, and it ends with a buyer from Lexington sitting at a table in eastern Kentucky, trying to reckon how a hobby operation had done what it had done. Let me start where it started. Harlan Vess was 63 years old in 1980 and was known in Cannell County for 2 things: his silence and his mules. He had farmed and worked the ground on 220 acres in the head of Piney Fork Hollow for 31 years, the same acres his father Wade had worked before him, and he spoke in complete sentences only when the subject was worth the effort. He stood 6 feet tall and had been slightly stooped for so long that people who met him young assumed he had always stood that way. His eyes were pale blue. His hair had gone thin and gray before he was 50. He had the hands of a man who had spent his life asking things of heavy animals and heavy ground, and his face showed the arithmetic of every season he had spent doing it. The 220 acres at Piney Fork had 2 things going for it, and 1 thing going against it. What it had going for it was the timber, secondly the pasture on the upper benches, and buried in the hillside along the eastern face, a narrow drift-mouth coal seam that ran for what Harlan's father had called a considerable piece. What went against it was that the seam was 14 inches at its thickest point and angled at close to 32 degrees. Every mechanized extraction outfit that had ever looked at it said the same thing, that the geometry was wrong. Too narrow for a continuous miner, too steep and too wet for a conventional haulage system. The coal was there. It was good, clean thermal coal, high BTU, low sulfur. But the only way to get it out was the way coal had always come out of hollows like that one before the equipment ever arrived, slowly, by hand, with animals. Wade Vess had worked that seam with a 4-mule team from 1941 through 1958. He had pulled the coal out in mined cars along a timber and rail track. He laid himself, felling the timber from the upper bench and milling the ties by hand at the portable mill he kept behind the equipment shed. The mules walked the rails in the dark and hauled loaded cars back to the drift mouth, where the coal could be sorted by hand and loaded onto the county road truck. He had 4 animals in those years, never more, and he knew each of them by name and by the particular way each one set its stride on the rail ties. He kept a tally ledger in a green canvas cover, a column for the date and the animal count and the tonnage, and a brief note in his small, even hand about the condition of the face and the weather and how the string had moved. Over 17 years, he filled 240 pages of it. When he died in 1961, he left the ledger to Harlan along with the chain and the note he had written inside the front cover. The note said that the right mule knows what you need before you ask it. The wrong one knows too. Harlan had been 23 when his father died. He had worked the surface farm for 20 years before he understood what that sentence was about, and another 10 before he had a use for it. The ledger sat on the kitchen shelf. Through all of those years, the green cover fading slightly at the spine, where the light from the window hit it. He opened it occasionally, reading the columns, checking tonnages against seasonal notes, comparing the face conditions Wade had described in 1944 with what he observed on his own surveys of the seam. The seam was there. It had always been there. It was waiting for whoever chose to pay the right kind of attention to it. Let me tell you what Harlan understood about mules, because it is the whole engine of what happened next. A mule bred for conventional work, the kind that moved through auction rings and brought good money, was selected on visible traits. Draft buyers in the Kentucky Coalfield auction circuit looked at height and weight and girth and conformation, the angle of the shoulder and the width of the chest and the set of the back legs. They looked for animals that stood calmly in a ring, that loaded easily into a trailer, that responded predictably to voice commands. A calm animal was a manageable animal, and a manageable animal was an efficient animal, and efficiency was what a spec sheet could measure. Those were good traits for open-field farm work or broad mine corridors where the terrain was predictable and the command arrived in advance of the need. They were not the traits that mattered in a 14-inch coal seam on a 32-degree pitch in the dark. What mattered in a seam like that was something the auction catalog did not have a column for. Harlan called it contact sense, which was his father's term, and it meant the animal's ability to feel the load chain tension and adjust its stride and footing simultaneously without waiting for a command. To understand why that quality was decisive, you have to understand what happened inside a narrow drift when the pitch changed. A 14-inch seam did not run level through rock that stayed the same. The pitch varied by a degree or two over every 20 feet of drift, and the floor was wet in places and dry in others, and the rails were timber set, not steel bedded, which meant small irregularities in the gauge that a machine would have ground through but that an animal had to read and accommodate in its step. When the grade increased suddenly, the drag chain went tight faster than a handler's voice could travel from the drift mouth to an animal 30 feet inside. An animal that required the voice before it adjusted its stride would break stride. And a stumble in a 14-inch seam meant a fallen animal, a derailed car, and the very real possibility of a man pinned in the dark. It had happened to other operators in other hollows, and it was one reason the mining establishment had long since decided that animal haulage in narrow drifts was not a viable practice. What they had decided without knowing it was that the animals they selected were poorly suited to the task. The animals suited to a narrow drift were not the calm ones. They were the animals whose nervous systems were reading the chain and the floor and the grade continuously, and producing the adjustment before a handler could have asked for it. Wade Vess had called this quality live feet, which was his shorthand for an animal whose feet were always in some small relationship with the ground under them, even when the animal appeared, still always reading what came next. An animal with live feet gave you grief in the ring and in the trailer and on the farm road, because it was responding to things constantly and not waiting to be told to. In the drift, that same quality was the only thing that kept the string moving at pace in the dark. The animals that demonstrated live feet at auction were the ones that disrupted the ring. They shifted when the crowd shifted. They changed pace when the auctioneer's cadence changed. They responded to things that were not commands because they were not waiting for commands. They were processing their environment at every moment and acting on what they read. Auction buyers read that as difficult. They pass them over. The prices on those animals ran between $140 and $220 a head. And for 4 years, from 1980 through 1984, Harlan Vest drove to 7 auctions a year and bought the animals nobody else wanted. He ended up with 40 of them. His total outlay was $7,200. That included the gray-black draft mule he brought home from a Floyd County auction in the spring of 1981 that the catalog described as temperamental, and the ring had passed on at $165. She was 14 years old and had a white snip on her nose, and Harlan named her Lucy. He put her in the paddock and watched her for 3 days before he worked her on a line. And what he watched was the way her feet were always in motion, small shifts of weight and position, reading the ground under her even when nothing was happening. On the 3rd morning, he put her in the equipment shed doorway with the other animals, and when the rooster in the yard flew up to the fence post 30 feet away, she adjusted her stance before the wings beat. He named her Lucy, and she became the lead of the string. Every other mule he bought in the following 3 years, he evaluated partly by how it moved when yoked beside Lucy. He was looking for an animal whose pace would settle into her rhythm, which was a low, measured pull with a slight forward lean that told him the animal was reading the chain and not waiting for instruction. If the new animal's rhythm did not match hers inside the first pass of the yard, it went back. The chain was his father's. It was 80 feet of drag chain, hand-spliced in 4 places where links had failed, the metal coated with surface rust that had never gone deep enough to weaken it. 3 estate sale buyers had looked at it in 1961 and passed because it looked like junk, which was a judgment about appearance, and said nothing about whether the links would hold. Harlan had taken it home and cleaned it, link by link, and oiled it, and hung it in the equipment shed, and it had been hanging there for 19 years before he needed it. That was when Dale Pruitt showed up at the Cannell County Equipment Barn. The demonstration in the spring of 1984 was the kind of event the regional equipment distributors held every few years to show operators what the newer systems could do. Dale was good at his job. He walked the crowd through the specs on the diesel skidder and the continuous haulage module and the projected tonnage rates per shift. And his numbers were accurate for the seams. Those machines were built to work. Toward the end, someone asked about the narrower, older-style drift operations still running in the county, and Dale looked up from his carousel with a patient expression. "Those are hobby operations," he said. "They're kept going by sentiment, not economics. The math doesn't work." He was not talking about Harlan specifically. He was talking about an entire category of practice he believed had already been retired by history. "You gentlemen with the foresight to invest in modern systems," he said, "are the ones who'll still be hauling in 5 years." Harlan was sitting in the second row and said nothing. He drove home, fed the mules, oiled the chain, and went to bed. His neighbor, Delbert Combs, took the lesson. Delbert was 51 years old that spring, big-shouldered and good-natured, and he operated a broader seam 2 ridges over from Piney Fork. He had been running a small, conventional haulage system on credit since 1978, and Dale Pruitt's numbers looked right to him because they were right for his operation. In the fall of 1984, Delbert signed a 12-year note for $62,000 at 14.5% interest and bought a used diesel skidder and a second-hand haulage unit. His monthly carrying cost came to approximately $860. He shook Dale's hand in the parking lot and drove the new equipment home on a flatbed while his wife took pictures from the porch. A tro, and Harlan watched Delbert's new equipment come down the county road from the far end of the pasture, where he was moving the string to the upper bench for the afternoon. He did not say anything about it to Delbert or to anyone else. End of footnote. He drove the mules up the bench road and went back to work. Cora Vess arrived in March of 1989. She was 24 years old and had just finished a degree in environmental science at the University of Kentucky. And she came to Piney Fork because her grandfather was the only family she had left in the county, and because she had not been back in 3 years and felt she owed it to him. She drove a 10-year-old Subaru with a University of Kentucky parking sticker on the bumper and wore a canvas field jacket over a chambray shirt, and she had the slight forward tilt of a person who had spent the last 4 years in classrooms and labs and was not sure how to hold herself in the presence of actual ground. She parked in the gravel by the equipment shed, and Harlan came out to meet her, and they shook hands the way the family always had, firm and brief, and he showed her inside. She had been raised partly at Piney Fork and partly in Hazard, after her parents moved there for work, and she remembered the hollow as a child remembers a place in smells and light and scale. It was smaller than she remembered in the way that all childhood places are smaller and quieter, and she sat at the kitchen table and drank coffee and tried to ask practical questions while her grandfather answered them, which was in the minimum number of words that said the true thing. He told her about the string and the rotation and the seam, and she listened and filed what he said and tried not to show that she was forming a category for it in her head that rhymed with what she had heard from her mother about Dale Pruitt and the extension meeting. In the fall of 1986, Pruitt had been back in the county presenting updated haulage efficiency tables to a room of 20 operators at the county extension office, and Harlan had walked in late and taken a seat in the back. Dale had seen him come in and had kept his voice warm and his expression friendly and had continued with his presentation. Toward the end, when someone asked about the older drift operations still running in the county, Dale had said that a man could certainly run a hobby operation on family ground if that was what he chose. That there was nothing wrong with that as a personal decision, but that anyone expecting to compete at tonnage needed to be thinking about diesel horsepower per shift. He had looked directly at Harlan when he said it, and his tone was the tone of a man delivering a kindness, and Harlan had looked back at him from the back row and then looked at his hands. He had not said anything. He had driven home and fed the mules and oiled the chain and gone to bed, which was what he did after every conversation he considered settled. Cora had not been at that meeting, but she had heard the story, and she had done what any 24-year-old with a new degree tends to do with a story that confirms what a respected authority has already said, which was to note it and move on. She stood in the drift mouth that first morning in March and watched her grandfather's animals work and tried to hold her trained eye steady on what she was seeing. What she was seeing was 40 mules in a careful rotation, 6 working the rails at a time, pulling loaded mine cars through a passage that a grown man could not stand upright in. Lucy ran lead, gray-black and measured, her white snip just visible in the lamp glow at the drift mouth. The chain ran from the collar tree to the first car and transferred the load down the string in a tension she could see in the links even from outside. The mules moved at a pace that would have looked unhurried to anyone who did not know what drift work required, each animal placing its feet on the rail ties with a precision that had nothing accidental in it. There was no engine noise. There was the sound of hooves on timber and chain links ticking, and the small creak of the car wheels, and the hollow near silence of the rock around it all. She stood there a while. Then she said, "How much is this actually producing?" Harlan said, "Enough." She wanted a better answer. That evening she went into the house and found the tally ledger on the kitchen shelf, the green canvas one her great-grandfather had started in 1941. Harlan had continued it in his own hand, beginning in 1980. The entries in the same column format Wade had used, the same unit measures, the tonnage and the date and the weather, and a brief note on the string's condition that day. She sat at the kitchen table under the hanging lamp and read through it for 2 hours. The numbers were consistent and specific and added up to something that did not match the categories she had filed the operation in. When she came back out to the drift the next morning, she said to her grandfather, "Is the ledger right?" He said it was. She stood at the drift mouth for a while, watching Lucy settle into the first pull of the day. Then she said, "Dale Pruitt called this a hobby operation." "I know he did," Harlan said. She did not say anything else that morning. She was quiet in a different way than she had been before she read the ledger. And Harlan noticed the difference without remarking on it, because he had been waiting for it since she arrived. If you have been following the story to this point and find yourself wondering what possessed Harlan Vest to keep working a seam most of his neighbors had called unworkable for 9 years on animals nobody would buy, you are asking exactly the right question. Hold it. The answer is in the coal. By the spring of 1987, Delbert's equipment was producing at roughly 80% of the tonnage projections Dale had presented in 1984, which was good, and his monthly note payment was staying current, which was also good, but his maintenance costs had run above the estimate in every year since he bought the unit. His skidder ran in a seam that was wetter than the original assessment had indicated, and wet ground 8 hydraulic seals at a rate that surprised his service technician on each visit. His 1986 maintenance total was $6,800 against an original estimate of $3,200 per year. His 1987 total was $7,400. He was still ahead of his note, but the margin was narrower than it had looked from the parking lot of the Cannell County Equipment Barn in the fall of 1984. Harlan's maintenance costs for the same 2 years came to $410. That was feed supplement, chain oil, 2 farrier visits, and a section of replacement rail timber. The animals ate the same hay they had always eaten. The chain required the same light oil it had always required. The farrier charged the same rates he had charged since 1978. If you want to understand what Delbert's equipment was costing him by the summer of 1989, you have to run the ledger the way Harlan ran it, column by column. Delbert's $62,000 note at 14.5% had been generating approximately $860 a month in carrying costs since late 1984. By July of 1989, that was 56 months of payments, which came to roughly $48,160 spent servicing a machine that the open market would have bought back. His maintenance bills had run well above the original estimate in 4 of the 5 years because the seam was wetter than the assessment had assumed, and wet ground 8 hydraulic seals and his April 1989 service call alone had run $4,200. He was still current on his note. He was still hauling at a reasonable pace. He told Harlan at the hardware store in July of 1989 that things were going fine, and he believed it, because they were. and because the diesel price had been stable for 2 years and there was no particular reason to expect it to change. The diesel price stopped being stable in August of 1989. A disruption at a regional refinery in the last week of July tightened supply across eastern Kentucky and southwestern Virginia and held it tight for 11 weeks. The allocation for non-essential industrial users in Cannell County was cut to 40% by the second week of August, and at 40% allocation, Delbert's haulage unit could not maintain operating temperature on the gradient his seam required. The skidder ran rich and through codes, and his service technician told him over the phone to idle the machines until supply normalized. Delbert asked when that would be. The technician said it was hard to say. The Kentucky Division of Mine Safety had been reviewing slope stability incidents across the region all summer, and in the third week of August, a citation requirement went out to 14 operations in 3 counties, requiring any mechanized surface hauler operating on grades above 25 degrees to submit an updated stability assessment before resuming work. Delbert's seam ran at 28 degrees. The assessment required a licensed mining engineer, and the earliest available appointment in the district was 11 weeks out, which happened to coincide almost exactly with the point at which the diesel allocation was expected to normalize. His equipment sat in the equipment shed. His note did not sit. It ran at $860 a month, regardless of whether the machines moved, and over the 11 weeks of the combined shutdown, his total carrying cost against 0 tons produced came to $9,460. He drove past Harlan's Road on his way to town in September and saw the drift-mouth lamp lit in the early morning and did not stop. He was doing his own arithmetic. Harlan's string needed no diesel. It needed the same hay and water. It had always needed the same daily quarter-hour of observation that Harlan had been giving it for 9 years. The same morning walk of the harness lines to check the fittings. His slope was 32 degrees, 7 degrees above the citation threshold, but the citation applied to mechanized haulage only. No engine, no citation. The mule operation was not mentioned in the citation letter at all, and Harlan never received one. He worked through every day of the 11 weeks. Lucy ran lead for the entire shutdown. The string pulled the same steady rotation it had pulled since 1981, 6 animals at a time in the drift. The chain transmitting load down the line and that load-ticking tension that Harlan had listened to so many mornings it had become a kind of baseline for how a good day sounded. His daily output averaged 11 tons of coal across the shutdown period. That was not fast by any standard Dale Pruitt would have recognized. It was not fast by any standard anyone else would have recognized either. It was continuous, which was the only standard that mattered in August of 1989. And it was the only operation of its kind in the county that could say it was. Cora had stayed through that summer. She had started by keeping the water schedule and had moved on to watching the string work each morning, and by September she had begun asking her grandfather about what her great-grandfather had written about individual animals in the 1941 ledger, comparing those notes to what she was watching in the drift. She had borrowed a soil chemistry textbook from the county extension office and was reading about bituminous coal formation in the evenings, and one night in late September, she asked Harlan about the upper seam, whether there was more behind the drift they were working. Harlan told her there was and said he had always expected to leave it for whoever came next. She looked at the ledger in her hands and then looked at him. She did not say anything for a while. In October of 1989, Ruth Nolan drove up the gravel road at Piney Fork Hollow in a rented sedan she had picked up in Lexington that morning. She was the senior acquisitions buyer for an independent coal cooperative, and she had been watching the certified scale tickets from Harlan's operation come through the county clearinghouse for the preceding 18 months with a level of attention she did not usually give to small string operations on narrow seam claims. The tickets were consistent. That was the first thing. They came in every 2 weeks, without exception, winter and summer, and the tonnage held within a tight band across all of them. A lot of small operations showed wide variance, weeks of nothing followed by a burst of output when conditions allowed. Harlan's string showed no variance at all. It simply worked in the same quiet, unbroken way, week after week. The second thing was the purity grade, PERS. Over the 18 months of certified tickets, Harlan's coal had come in at a moisture content and ash percentage that put it in the top 12% of thermal coal sold through the regional clearinghouse that year. Ruth had bought coal out of Cannell County for 11 years, and she had not seen purity numbers like that from a drift-mouth seam in that county. The low ash and low sulfur figures were a function of the seam's character, which was dense and clean and had been undisturbed by mechanical overburden for decades, and of the haulage method, which did not expose the coal face to diesel exhaust or engine heat that could contaminate the surface chemistry. Animal haulage in a narrow drift, it turned out, left the face in a condition that mechanical extraction could not replicate in a seam of that geometry. The coal came out the way the seam held it. Over those same 18 months, Delbert had moved 1,240 tons from a broader and faster seam, but his grade had averaged out below Harlan's at a moisture and ash profile that put his coal at market standard rather than above it. His tonnage rate was higher in the months his equipment ran, but the 11-week shutdown had cut a clean gap in his output record and his net for the period, after $15,480 in equipment carrying costs came to $20,480. Ruth sat at Harlan's kitchen table. She set the certified scale ticket on the table between them and looked at it for a while and then looked at Harlan. He sat across from her with his hands flat on the table, the way he sat at every table, not restless, not performing calm, just still. She said, "How do you keep the face this clean?" Harlan said, "Animals don't idle." Ruth was quiet for a long time after that. Outside, the drift lamp was lit at the mouth of the seam, and she could hear faintly the sound of the chain. She looked at the scale ticket again. Then she named her price. $31.50 a ton on everything he could deliver through the end of the year, with a standing offer to renegotiate upward at the spring market opening. Harlan's gross on the 18 months of certified coal, at the average price his tickets had already captured through the clearinghouse, came to $57,960. After feed, labor, and maintenance on the string, his net was $44,200. Against zero debt, the number sat on the table between them in the kitchen at Piney Fork Hollow, and neither of them spoke for a while. Ruth folded her hands and looked at the scale ticket and then at Harlan, and the drift lamp held its light at the tunnel mouth outside, and the chain went quiet between pulls. Ruth said she had been buying coal in eastern Kentucky for 30 years and had not once seen an operation producing numbers like these from a seam that every mechanized operator in the county had walked away from calling unworkable. She said it without drama. She was not flattering him. She was saying the arithmetic was unusual and that the market above standard grade would pay the price she had named, and that was the whole of it. Cora was standing in the doorway to the kitchen. She had the green ledger in her hand, open to the 1981 entries in her great-grandfather's writing, and she was looking at her grandfather. Harlan looked at the contract, Ruth slid across the table, and then at Cora, and then back at the contract. He picked up Ruth's pen and signed it. Dale Pruitt heard about the scale ticket through the County Extension Office network that winter. He drove out to Piney Fork in January of 1990 in his company truck, cleaner boots than the ones he had worn in 1984, and stood in the equipment shed looking at the chain hanging on its hook and the harness rows and the 40 animals in the paddock beyond. He stood there for a while. Then he turned to Harlan and said, "I got the numbers wrong." Harlan did not tell him he had. He just nodded. Dale said, "What do I need to understand about these animals?" He had his notepad out, the same one he used for spec sheets. He was not asking to score a point. He was asking the way a person asks when something they were certain of has turned out to be incomplete. Harlan said, "Come back in spring when I'm working the upper drift. You can watch." Delbert came that spring, too. He had settled his situation with the bank by selling the skidder at a loss and paying down the note with the equity, and he was looking at his options. Harlan gave him the walk-around of the string, explaining what he had been buying at auction and why, and Delbert asked the kind of questions that meant he was serious. By that summer, Delbert had attended 2 auctions with Harlan and purchased 6 animals of his own. Animals the catalog had flagged as difficult and the ring had passed over at $160 a head. Harlan helped him build the first rotation schedule. Cora stayed at Piney Fork. She paid her lease on the apartment in Lexington through the end of the month and then let it go. She did not make a formal announcement about this. She told her grandfather she was staying through the spring to help with the upper drift planning, and then stayed through the summer, and then through the fall. And by the time the question of her staying came up again directly, she had been running the morning rotation schedule for 4 months. She took the ledger and the harness records and began building a formal catalog of the string's individual animals, their traits and their auction histories, and the specific notes Harlan and Wade had made about how each one moved in the drift. She recorded what contact sense looked like differently in each animal. Some expressed it through a shortening of the stride on an upward grade, a quarter-step adjustment that preceded any tension change in the chain. Some expressed it through a slight weight shift at the collar that the handler at the drift mouth could feel through 40 feet of chain before any rate change showed up in the car speed. Well, she wrote it all out in a new spiral notebook, the kind they sold at the county hardware store, and set the green canvas ledger beside it on the kitchen shelf, the 2 books close together on the same length of wood. What she was building, though she did not call it that yet, was the document her great-grandfather had been writing in rough form since 1941, without knowing it would one day need to be a document. It was the knowledge the auction catalog could not contain, and the spec sheet had no role for. She typed it into a clean copy the following spring and sent it to the University of Kentucky Extension Service Office in Lexington, where it eventually contributed to a small publication on historic narrow-seam animal haulage methods. The publication did not circulate widely. It did not need to. What mattered was that the knowledge had a form now that could be passed and held. By 1992, there were 4 operations in the county, running mule strings on narrow seam work, counting Delbert, and 2 others who had come out to Piney Fork in the spring of 1991, after hearing from Delbert what Harlan had been producing. None of the 4 operations were large, none of them needed to be. The seams they worked were the ones every mechanized system had dismissed as too thin, too angled, too wet, too awkward to bother with. The animals they ran were the ones every auction ring had passed over as too sensitive, too reactive, too difficult to manage in a ring. The chains they used were heavy and old and had been handed down or pulled from estate sales at the price of scrap. The knowledge that made those strings work was not in a spec sheet. It was not in a horsepower table or a slide carousel or a projected tonnage per shift figure. It lived in the reed of an animal's shoulder at the moment the grade changed, in the pause before a command that told a handler the mule had already begun the adjustment, in 50 years of daily notation, in 2 handwritings in a green canvas ledger that had once sat on a shelf in a farmhouse kitchen, was 4. What a system can measure and what a system can do are not always the same thing. An auction catalog measured size and calm, and the willingness to stand still in a ring. It could not measure contact sense, which was the trait that mattered in the dark. A spec sheet measured horsepower and torque and fuel consumption per shift. It could not measure what happened when the fuel stopped. Dale Pruitt came back to Piney Fork 3 times in the 2 years after January of 1990. On his 3rd visit, he brought a young equipment rep he was training, and he let Harlan show the man the drift and the string and the chain and explain what he was looking for in an animal that nobody else would buy. Pruitt stood in the background with his notepad and listened and did not interrupt. He had updated his understanding. He was doing what a good faith person does when the world has revised their model. He was watching and writing things down. The upper drift, the one Harlan had told Cora was, for whoever came next, opened in the spring of 1993. Cora ran the rotation schedule. Lucy was the lead animal again, 23 years old by then, her white snip gone gray around the edges, her pace unchanged. She walked the rail in the drift with the same settled, low pull she had brought out of the Floyd County auction in 1981, and she adjusted her stride to the grade without a cue, the way she always had, the chain transmitting her decision to the cars behind her before any voice reached her ears. The chain was the one that had hung in the equipment shed for 19 years. It was the one 3 estate buyers had passed on in 1961 because it looked like junk. It was still doing what it had always done. There is a kind of knowledge that spreads wide and moves fast and trusts that what it can put in a column is what matters. There's another kind that goes narrow and deep and stays in one place until the column proves to be incomplete. The first kind tends to win the early years, when the conditions hold and the fuel is available and the geometry cooperates. The second kind tends to survive the years when it doesn't. The animals that knew what you needed before you asked were always there. In the auction ring, they were the difficult ones, the sensitive ones, the ones the catalog could not adequately describe and the ring could not adequately price. They cost $180 a head. They ran a chain that looked like it belonged in a salvage yard. They pulled coal out of a seam that every modern system had called unworkable. What you could measure and what was there were never quite the same thing. Lucy was still in harness.